All righty, great. We see folks from, of course, all around the Colorado area, but also beyond joining us. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our COVID-19 webinar series brought to you by the Institute for Science and Policy, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and our partners, the Colorado School of Public Health. I want to say good morning and acknowledge our dear friend, Dr. John Samet, the Dean of the School of Public Health, who is actually joining us backstage today this morning. And a huge thank you to him and everything that he's been doing at the School of Public Health. I'm Kristen Uhlenbrock, your host for the series. It's great to see so many familiar faces joining us here today. I see all of your names popping up here in the chat. So thank you for tuning in on Zoom. If you're also joining us on Facebook Live or on YouTube, hello to over there. We're so grateful to have you joining us today. If you've missed any of our recent episodes, we do have video recordings and written transcripts. Just go to the institute.dmns.org website. You can find links to all of that and to our YouTube channel to watch any of the past recordings. I do want to acknowledge here at the top that Monday was a significant and sobering milestone. We did pass 500,000, 500,000 deaths, American deaths here in the US. And so while we do see cases plummeting, we are still need to remain vigilant because this pandemic is not over. And today we are going to take a different approach to how we've been tackling some of these topics. Today is episode 27, and we're going to be kicking off a 3-part mini-series as part of this larger series, where we're kind of using the theme, the road to a new normal. And I use my little quotation marks around new normal. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking a little bit about the past, reflecting on where we've come, and putting on a little bit of what we can anticipate as far as future or lasting changes. Today, we're going to be tackling the future of science and public health. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking about the future of education. And then the third part of that series, we'll be talking about the future of business and culture as it relates to changes from this pandemic. Many of us do see a little bit of a light of normalcy on the horizon coming, but there's still much uncertainty on when we will get back to this normal or this new normal, whatever that looks like, and even what that may look like on the other side of this pandemic. Immunization, of course, is going to play a significant role of part of when and how we get there. And I think many of you may have also read that Dr. Fauci had just made the prediction. I think he said we may be wearing masks into 2022. So the long-term effects of this pandemic are going to play out for many, many years, and there will be lasting changes on our scientific enterprise, which we will be talking a little bit about today. And I am thrilled to be joined by a very esteemed, very prestigious guest, Dr. Harvey Feinberg. Dr. Harvey Feinberg is the president of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. He previously served as president of the U.S. Institute of Medicine, also now known as the National Academy of Medicine. He was provost of Harvard University and dean of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Prior to joining the foundation, he devoted most of his academic career to the field of health policy and medical decision-making. His research has focused on global health, assessment of medical technology, evaluation and use of vaccines, and dissemination of medical information. He has led a very prestigious career, and we are honored to have him joining us this morning. Good morning, Dr. Feinberg. How are you?
Well, good morning, Kristen. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you so much for that kind introduction.
Oh, we are thrilled to have you, and you are joining us from the West Coast, is that correct?
It is true. I'm based now in San Francisco, so it's a little earlier here than in Denver, but it's a beautiful day, so we're looking forward to the conversation very much.
Great. Well, thank you for getting up and joining us this morning at 7:30 your time. Our audience loves this 8:30 time slot Mountain Time, so we have some morning people with us today. All right, we're going to dive in, and just so the audience is aware, we are going to be in full conversation for the next 45 minutes. If you have questions, sit them in the chat. We'll try to incorporate them as we go along. But I want to give Harvey a few minutes here just at the top and hear his take on our current situation. How are we doing right now as a nation and as a globe, as a world?
This pandemic is in a really critical moment of inflection. We're past the end of the beginning, but are we very far into the beginning of the end? That's a question for us to ponder. You mentioned a very critical milestone, 500,000 deaths counted officially in the United States attributable to the COVID pandemic. The actual number is very likely somewhat more than that because of undercounts of deaths, but it's a pretty serious number. To put it in perspective in pandemics, if you go back to the 1918, 1919 great influenza, that pandemic also cost about 500,000 lives in the United States. That was a time when the US population was less than a third of what it is today. So imagine if today we had experienced not 500,000, but 1.5 million fatalities. Imagine if we had no idea what a virus even was at this point. Imagine if vaccines against the pandemic were nowhere in the offing. Imagine the terror and concern, the deep fear that would have instilled in us at that time. A century later, it's been incredibly hard. Every life lost, we say in public health, statistic is a number with a tier attached to it. Every life lost is a serious loss. And it has repercussions throughout a family and a community. On top of that, the disruption to our economy has been so profound and affected so many individuals in such a dramatic way. And the crisis has extended to our educational system. I was delighted to hear your plan to look ahead to education, because the disruption to children's schooling throughout the United States has been truly a horrific component of this pandemic. So we are in the midst. We are, however, seeing the trends of improvement that you also alluded to. In the second week of January of this year, the average number of new cases per day exceeded 250,000. Now we're down below 60,000 per day of new cases in a trend line that has been very naturally, I would say, almost a straight decline over the last weeks since mid-January. So that's really encouraging. What is not known at this time, and still a matter of speculation, is what will the course of the pandemic be as we look ahead in the next 6 to 12 months. On the encouraging side, we have the vaccine that is now been deployed in the United States to about 40 million initial doses, and about half that number have gotten the full 2-dose regimen of immunization. We have the seasonal advantage coming into our summer, which for respiratory infections very typically is a season which is less severe in terms of the spread of the infection. But on the other side, we know historically that these pandemics often go through periods of waxing and waning, and often can sustain for more than a year or even 2. That's a reason why Dr. Fauci's alert that we may still be wearing masks for a number of months. That's what's behind that. And the main uncertainty today has to do with the arrival of the variants to the virus. These variants, which have different capacities for spread, for infectivity, may be eluding our vaccines, may be harder to detect in our diagnostic tests. So that throws a kind of monkey wrench into the plans. It creates a level of uncertainty that would give caution to any predictions about what the future course is going to be. So in summary, we've been through a lot. We have suffered an extraordinary burden of mortality. The trends at the moment in new cases are improving, and that means that in weeks following, the number of hospitalizations improve, and in weeks following that, the number of mortalities also improve. So that's good. But the uncertainty, looking ahead, knowing the history of these pandemics and recognizing the wild card of the variant strains of the virus, those are the uncertainties looking ahead.
Thank you for that. And I want to just pick up on, there's lots of threads there we want to pick up on, but one in particular, I think I remember it was Dr. Peter Hotez, who was on earlier in our season talking about vaccines. And he had made a staggering number that I think I hadn't heard before, which he had the prediction of, and this is looking at the global vaccination of the whole world. And he said, it's about 10 years out. I think both from ensuring that children were vaccinated and that, not as wealthy countries who have been supplying large doses of vaccines, but reaching all countries, all worlds around he had the prediction of about 10 years before he felt that would be a time frame when maybe we really had this pandemic globally under control in that really kind of way that I think people are hoping for. Thoughts on, again, you've given some timelines too, any reactions to that 10-year remark he had made, and I will say this is about 5 months ago we had him on or so.
Well, Dr. Peter Hotez is extraordinarily well informed, a great expert, and I respect his judgment enormously. In my own thinking, I make a differentiation between trying to project elements that depend on nature, which would include, for example, the future of these variant strains of virus, and elements that depend on human response and action. So in the case of global immunization, yes, part of it is going to depend on the need, which is a natural phenomena, but a big part of it depends on the mobilization, commitment, and determination of nations and peoples of the world to accomplish a task. So in a sense, the speed of immunization will depend on our capacity to produce effective vaccines, to distribute them fairly, equitably, and efficiently, and to ensure that the resources that are needed to reach every country and every vulnerable individual are applied. So this is a matter that is under our control. It's not a matter of the natural world. And for that reason, I would like to hope that the response could in fact be somewhat accelerated, but it depends on the choices and commitments that countries and leaders and individuals will make.
So let's pick up on that and focus specifically on the US. And, I work at the Institute for Science and Policy, so we immediately talk about the interaction and distinction between decision-making, policy-making, and science in the two. And I know you have a wealth of experience in this. So, looking at the US and our governance structure here, and we've talked about this with a couple other people, but I would love your take too on, how are we structured? Where are there really good strengths in our governance structure as a nation, understanding national versus state versus local authorities and who leads and when? What are our strengths here and what are our weaknesses when trying to manage this really sustained pandemic and crisis?
From a global point of view, international comparison, the threat of a coronavirus outbreak, of a COVID-19 pandemic, really throws into sharp relief the strengths and weaknesses of different forms of governance, different cultural values, different attitudes and levels of trust between a population and a government. When you look at the United States of America, our fundamental principles of constitutional government is a federal system. Sovereign states came together to form the Union, represented in our Constitution. The Constitution assigns certain powers to the federal government, and it says that remaining powers are in the hands of the individual states. Throughout America's hundreds of years of history, we've constantly had a tension and a struggle between the elements of sovereignty that adhere to the nation as a whole, to the federal system, and the elements of sovereignty that adhere to the individual states. When it comes to a matter of a pandemic, of a national response within a context of a global threat, in the United States, our federal system represents elements of strength and elements of weakness. Among the strengths are the fact that different parts of the country can experiment in different ways to advance on the problem, and we can learn from one another. The weakness is that our federal system depends on a degree of coherence, uniformity, collaboration, and joint action across the entire nation, from the national level all the way down to the local level. And the United States is not intrinsically set up with a command and control unified system of management of a response from the federal to the state to the local levels. It requires the active participation, cooperation, understanding, and decision-making in a mutual way to achieve that kind of coherence. We generally do in national emergencies come together as a nation. We came together after 9/11, most recently in our memories, in a way that overcame all of the intrinsic political, structural elements that keep us separate. In the case of a pandemic, especially where it was easy to add in the political elements of consideration when the crisis was not only a health crisis, but also an economic crisis. And we talked about the educational crisis and the more general social burden of the disease, but the balance of interest and of focus on the health and medical care side as compared to the economic setback that the pandemic created a political tension that has dogged us throughout the pandemic. And so the US is tremendously strong in individual innovation, cooperation at the individual levels, collaboration, and willingness to try new things, to experiment. But we have, by virtue of our constitutional structure, a natural set of divisions that when we're trying to manage a coherent national response, we have to overcome.
And let's take that one step larger and build on that into the global response and the global relations that we have as a country and our role in a global framework, including the WHO, including, support of vaccines. An audience here was, questioning, if a country refuses to bring in an effective vaccination program, what is that like? So and we have a new administration, right? And so what's your take on where we are in that forward look of what you're hoping for a global relations and global response?
The World Health Organization has a dual mandate. On the one hand, it is expected, and the Director General is expected to be the moral and programmatic leader of global response to health threats such as the COVID. At the same time, the World Health Organization is the product of its member states. It only has the authority, the money, the will to act that is represented in the collective will of the member states of the World Health Organization. So there's this constant tension between how far can the leadership pull the states and how willing are the states to push along that leadership. In a case of a global pandemic, it is never solved anywhere until it is truly solved everywhere. And therefore, if we, even out of what we might call enlightened self-interest, want to overcome this pandemic, we have to be part of a global response to manage and suppress and overcome this global threat to health. On top of that, of course, is the imperative from a humanitarian perspective of doing the right thing to treat every life with the same respect and the same value, regardless of whether it happens to be in country A, country B, or country C. So from both a humanitarian perspective and a perspective of enlightened self-interest, they both compel us a decision in the same direction, which is to actively engage and participate and to be part of the global solution. How does that translate exactly into resources, into allocations of vaccines, for example, into distribution of medical protective equipment and other necessary resources? These practical issues have to be played out in real time. In the ideal circumstance, a lot of these decisions, for example, about vaccine sharing, can be spelled out and codified in advance of a particular outbreak, because when you do it in advance without the pressure of the immediate crisis, you have a much better chance of coming to grips with a fair and equitable and acceptable arrangement from everyone's point of view. The WHO tried that and has tried that with influenza vaccines. When the expectation periodically, we know, is that influenza is another one of these bad actors that can create global pandemics. But now we're trying to solve the problem for COVID in real time, under real pressure. On top of that, there's certain practicalities. For example, the two currently approved vaccines in the United States have very strict cold chain requirements for their distribution, very low temperature of maintaining these vaccines. And that creates a natural barrier to their widespread use in many parts of the world. So we have to be both practical and humane. We have to act out of enlightened self-interest and out of doing the right thing. So we're in the midst of it right now. We have an administration in place today that has a very different attitude about America's place in the world, its participation, its responsibilities, its sense of partnership with others. And I think we're going to see continued growth of commitment among nations of the world to provide the resources, the vaccines, the funding, and the human capacity that will help many, if not all, countries cope more effectively with this pandemic.
Thank you for that. And let me ask this question, and you kind of spoke to it, but I just want to make sure I understood. Did we, at the WHO global level, did we have a plan, a vaccination distribution, an equitable plan in place pre-SARS-CoV-2, this pandemic? Or was it not a solid plan? Or, you said there's some practical challenges here with, of course, the two vaccines with the cold storage needs. So was there a plan in place? I just want to clarify. And if there isn't, is that something you think we're going to get to? So on the other side of this, where it's developed and there's a really solid kind of agreement in place after this pandemic?
There have been partial plans, particularly with influenza, in which there are pre-positioned agreements on the part of different countries in terms of the vaccines that they will accept and the vaccines that they will utilize. But there were so many uncertainties with the COVID-19, and including the fact that no one anticipated that we would have a coronavirus that was as severe, as widespread, as complex as this one, And so there were no pre-positioned agreements and commitments, in part because there was no available vaccine at the early time. So this is all now being worked out in real time.
Mhm. And in the future, will these things be worked out in real time, do you think? It sounds like there's going to be a little bit of both potentially, like some rough frameworks and then some real time
Yeah,
adaptation.
it's very hard to anticipate all the contingencies. I mean, for example, the cold chain requirement, making
Right.
something impractical. But we can do a lot better at putting in place many of the preconditions, the legal agreements that would facilitate vaccination distribution in real time in the future.
Thank you. Also, just because we're speaking of the WHO, I had pulled up one of their situation reports from a year ago today. It was their WHO situation report number 35, so February 24th, 2020. And it was focused on stigma. And I want to read the pretty much the high level bullet takeaway quote from it, where they wrote, since the emergence of COVID-19, we have seen instances of public stigmatization among specific populations and the rise of harmful stereotypes. And so, at the time, in China and Wuhan, when we first identified the SARS-CoV-2, I think by February last year, the majority of the known cases were still in China. There was the rise in a lot of anti-Asian discrimination. We've kind of seen that throughout the pandemic still, both in a variety of ways. And we've seen, of course, stigmatization in other races and cultures as well, too. And we've spoken about this recently with the rise of the variants in particular countries and the potential stigmatization around the variants. I just wondered, could you talk a little bit about what are successful ways that we should be thinking about and combating when we see discrimination tied to whole swaths of cultures and races in countries like this?
Kristen, the history of disease and pandemics is filled with the idea of blaming the other, someone else. You can go back to the early 19th century and the names for syphilis. The English called it the French disease, the French called it the German disease. I'm not sure who the Germans attributed it to, but it was always some other that was the source, the origin, the responsible party for the disease that was now afflicting us. In the case of naming of diseases, one of the steps that the World Health Organization has taken is to do away with naming according to the place where a particular organism is first detected. The 1918-1919 influenza is popularly known as the Spanish flu, as an example. It didn't start in Spain. It was actually first reported in Spain by the news media because Spain was neutral in World War I, and the combatant countries were suppressing any press reports of information that could give comfort to the enemy. And so the outbreaks of these diseases on other parts of the European continent were never reported. It was reported in Spain, and that became the name. And so not only are the epithets and characterizations, attributions about places or peoples misplaced, misguided, and misleading, but history teaches that they're often just totally erroneous. I guess human instinct is always to look to blame someone else for our troubles. In the case of infections, yes, it's true, they all start somewhere, but occasionally they start in ways that are indiscernible exactly where and when it was originally starting. It is important from the point of view of epidemiology and virology tracking, and especially being able to predict future outbreaks and to control them, to work on assessing, analyzing, tracing back understanding the origin and both place and circumstance where an outbreak may have begun. But that shouldn't extend to the idea of naming and blaming so that it excuses anything that we do because it's really someone else's fault that we are suffering from this condition. You may know the Chinese have the kind of rumor going around that this was an American disease planted in China because of the enmity from the administration to the Chinese. So it's not exclusively an American flaw to blame others, but it is a human tendency that is best resisted when we're trying to deal honestly and effectively with something as serious as a COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you. I'm going to switch us gears just a little bit and move into some public health and medical and scientific features of this a little bit more in the details. And one of them that we actually haven't really talked about at all in this series. So Harvey, you get to share what this is and talk about it to your best of your ability, is the emergency use authorization that the FDA uses in issues. And at a really high level, for those of you who may know, because we have a lot of smart people in our audience, but if you are not familiar with emergency use authorizations, it is a somewhat newer tool or policy. I'll let Harvey explain a little bit better. But it's a way to give authorization when we don't have a full wealth of data and tests and clinical trials like we typically would for a treatment or a drug. And it gives the approval from the FDA to roll that out. Hydroxychloroquine was one of the earlier ones in the COVID-19 pandemic that I think received an EUA, an emergency use authorization, and later retracted. And there have been, of course, many others, including we've had these for the vaccinations that we currently have. So could you talk a little bit about this tool that the FDA has? It's going to have both risk and benefits, and there's going to be trade-offs to using it. It's a new tool in essence, right? I think it's been around for maybe about a decade or so. So how is this a useful tool in managing a crisis in a pandemic like that? And you know, is this going to be a new way of doing business for us in the US when it comes to trying to manage a crisis?
Well, thank you, Kristen. The US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, really has set the world standard for careful and effective review of new medications, new drugs, new devices that could be applied to treat patients. And the FDA standards for approving a drug or a vaccine or a device are very rigorous. They require extensive documentation from the manufacturer and from independent parties about the effectiveness and safety of the proposed drug. They require comparisons against placebos, meaning an agent that is believed to have no effect, and the treating clinician and the recipient doesn't know whether they've gotten the real agent as being tested or the placebo. And the reason placebo control is so important isn't because a placebo literally does nothing, but anytime you receive anything that you believe could help you, for example, you could have an effect. So you want to compare the candidate drug against something that actually could have a benefit, and you want to make sure that there's a genuine, if you will, physiological, biochemical, metabolic benefit from the agent. Now, these rigorous standards for approval have limitations, especially when you may have a condition that is relatively rare, extremely serious, life-threatening, and where there could be an experimental agent that is available to treat. And so the FDA has an option it calls compassionate use, which can authorize individual one-off use. And then, as you point out, this intermediate level of of authorization called Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA, was put in place about a decade ago to provide a capacity for the FDA to say, in effect, well, there's enough promise and enough need that we're going to authorize this agent's use under these emergency circumstances, even though it has not yet met the full requirements for approval. If you talk to any of the FDA experts, they're very careful not to use the word approval when they talk about these EUA authorized agents, because they want to differentiate the full approval from the emergency use authorization. Now, to be very clear, even when a drug or vaccine has received full approval, that is no guarantee that it will work in every patient, nor is it any guarantee that in time there might not be new evidence that would question the wisdom of the initial approval. With emergency use authorization, when the standard for allowing the use, authorization, is even lower, this means that it's available to use and the evidence looks promising. At the same time, it has not met the rigorous standards for full approval. Both of our vaccines are under emergency use authorization. The monoclonal antibodies that are being deployed are under emergency use authorization. And it is true, at one time, hydroxychloroquine was an agent that was under EUA, since withdrawn. That's a very interesting example because it clearly was clouded by a political repeated boosting of this agent, which was not without reason. I mean, there were laboratory indications that hydroxychloroquine, along with many, many other, by the way, available drugs, ivermectin is another one that's being tested today. The question is always, do we have anything off the shelf that could be effective against this virus? It would be a fantastic advantage. Hydroxychloroquine, a treatment for malaria, did show some action, what's called in vitro, in the laboratory, against the virus. But we know from many, many experiences that that is no assurance about what will actually happen in a patient who is infected and then treated with this agent. The only way to learn is to actually do the trials. And when you had a politicization of the advantages of this untested agent, where we had clinical and scientific experts constantly telling us it needs to be tested, it needs to be tested, and political figures constantly telling us it's going to be a miracle, it's going to save everybody, that created a lot of tension and pressure. And I suspect in the fullness of time, as this story of the COVID response plays out, this set of actions at the FDA is not going to be to its credit over time on the hydroxychloroquine decision making. But it has been withdrawn. Every clinical trial that has been reported has demonstrated that that particular agent is not effective. And it's a lesson that in medical science, you look for those that are promising, and then you do the clinical trials. If you don't do the clinical trials, you simply cannot know whether or not this agent holds any value in the treatment of a patient.
Thank you. I think we could do a whole episode on that, Harvey, and it's hitting on a lot of interesting threads that we like to talk about, including trust and trust in researchers and experts and losing trust and maintaining trust and the politicization. So I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because we have only a few minutes left, and your expertise has been brilliant. So I want to get to just a couple more topics before we can wrap up, but thank you for that response regarding EUAs. What's your take on the role of telemedicine, which has seen a big increase in boom? Is that going to be something that's lasting and changing for us? What does that look like in your perspective?
That's a fascinating question. One of the effects of response to the COVID, including, well, use of Zoom, like we're meeting right now, or in medical care, the growing prominence of telemedicine. Many of these experiences that we were forced to try because we could not gather in the usual traditional ways are going very likely to have a lasting impact on the conduct of our lives, whether it's amount of travel or arrangements at work, or the ways in which museums of science are going to be responding in the future to the interests and needs of the public, or the way in which medical care is practiced, and especially the role of telemedicine. These are going to play out in various ways in the future. Telemedicine is one area that has many advantages in principle. I can remember the days when it started out as literally telephone medicine, where you had telephone consultation. And now, with the advent of our ability to be able to see one another and examine over with a camera, what does that rash really look like? And what does the patient look like? That gives a level of advantage and opportunity in clinical care that really offers tremendous gains of efficiency. It saves the patient travel. It makes the use of the professional nursing and physician time much more efficient. It can accomplish many things successfully. And we are very likely to see a greater continued reliance on this form of medical consultation going forward, along with other impacts on medicine and public health, surely, as we go forward. But telemedicine is a really good example of the forced experiment under COVID that's likely to have lasting effect in the way we live our lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me give you one final chance here too, and leave it an open floor. We've talked about a lot of things, but in your mind, what's something we haven't talked about that is potentially a major change to our scientific, medical, public health system that you think is going to maybe be a lasting change for us?
From the point of view of conduct of science, I think another two influences of COVID are, first, demonstrating the importance of fundamental research, basic research. The idea that a vaccine could be developed in the space of a year actually rests on a very deep well of prior research, understanding the basics of virology, of immunology, of RNA technology, that has enabled the applied development in a very short time. And a second is a big boost to open science and collaboration as a mechanism to more rapidly advance when there is a defined objective that needs to be met in science. And so the practice of science, I think, is going to be also influenced in an ongoing way, just as so many aspects of how we live our lives, the way we relate to one another, the disparities in our society, the telemedicine example that you cited, all of these are going to be affected, and some more profoundly, including in the practice of science as we look forward beyond COVID.
Absolutely. Harvey, this was a great joy and pleasure. Thank you. These 45 minutes flew by. And I just want to say thank you very much for your time today. I absolutely enjoyed our conversation, and I think our audience hopefully did as well.
Kristen, it's such a pleasure to interact with you and to be part of this wonderful series. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you everyone for tuning in today as well. Hopefully you enjoyed this as much as I did. I could talk to Harvey all day, it feels like, but I'm gonna know how busy of a person he is. So we're gonna let him go. And I wanna say thanks to our audience. Nicole just dropped in where you can find both ours and the Moore Foundation social channels. We'll see you back here in 2 weeks, and that would be March 10th, if I get my dates right, where I mentioned we're going to talk about the future of education, both the impacts of COVID-19 currently, as well as what we think are going to be some big challenges. And we haven't really spoken a lot about education, and we have a lot of questions about that. So I know hopefully you all will enjoy that episode here in 2 weeks. We got a nice panel for that. Hopefully you're doing well this week. Please stay safe. Please stay healthy. Take care of yourselves and your families. And we look to see you back here in 2 weeks. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your week.